Hey there folks, Wrel here. The topic of Hossin comes up often enough to warrant a video about because people don't tend to play there, despite a reasonable portion of the community voicing how good of a continent it actually is, and that they wish that they were able to play there more. So we're going to dig into some theory on why Hossin is the least played continent of them all, and what can possibly be done in the future to correct that, if anything. So back in 2014, when Hossin was first released, it was done so in an early expedition sort of beta format, where a fair amount of the bases were stamped as construction sites, and they were meant to be placeholders until the real bases were finished. The continent came out of early expedition later that year, but not all of the construction sites were replaced. Not the worst thing in the world, because the construction sites are actually pretty decent bases in and of themselves, but it does point to the continents not getting enough development time, or just being rushed out the door. Another indicator of this is that plateaus are scattered around the map without very much detail work done to them, or accessibility, or bases or doodads built around or upon them. There was also a new facility type called the Interlink that was available in an early incarnation of Hossin, but never actually made it to live. The Interlink looked pretty, but it would have played poorly because of how it was set up. Too many firing angles from weird places, long traversal times to important areas that force you to cross dead zones without cover, and would probably have ended up a performance nightmare due to the density of props that were there. Again though, looked super pretty, there were definitely some cool concepts to explore there, and the building props, the individual pieces, could someday make their way into the game, kind of as one-offs. But I digress. Hossin was unfinished, but being finished means next to nothing in this game because Indar was finished like 3 times over, Amarish was finished twice, Aasimar was finished twice, and we all know how that turned out. Now there is the mentality that nobody plays on Hossin because no one plays on Hossin. That isn't necessarily untrue, but it doesn't actually mean anything. If Hossin was more enjoyable for more players, then more players would play on the continent. And as far as the overall design goes, Hossin is outstanding. It's the most symmetrical of all the continents, it has the best lattice links in my opinion, it has good base variety, and it does a reasonable job of separating the infantry and air game most of the time, but it is not without its misgivings. For ground vehicles in particular, Hossin is an absolute bottleneck. Most lanes to bases are through canyons with limited maneuverability, meaning that open field vehicle combat is rare, practically non-existent, and vehicle combat to bases leaves you no way to flank, which results in really stale one-dimensional gameplay. And once vehicles actually do get to a base, there just isn't a whole lot of fighting around it, which leaves you very few ways you can actually influence the fight in a vehicle. For infantry players, this is a good thing because it reduces the amount of explosive spam and spawn camping from vehicles, but for vehicle players or just players in vehicles, there isn't a whole lot left to do except to wait for the base to be captured so that you can move on to the next one. History has shown that players tend to like continents with open field fights and rolling cover for infantry that allows them to slowly make progress down a lattice. Aasimar is an example of open field combat going to extremes, where cover is practically non-existent in most areas, and some of the best fights to a base on Aasimar happen around the bridge areas. The reason for that being that the bridge provides cover, which allows players to inch their way toward a base. Amarish and Indar, same thing, but a lot more natural rolling cover in the form of hills and trenches. If you defend a base, you push out the attackers, you pick up momentum. If it feels like you should be foot zerging to the next base, that's how you know that the lattice and cover in between those bases was done correctly. You can tell by the amount of players who participate in those sorts of events versus the amount that redeploy or get frustrated and leave. It's a fair assumption to say that most players enjoy that aspect of the game, and it's certainly when the game feels most like it has a combined arms element in a way that doesn't result in a crappy spawn room farm fest. If you think about Regent Rock to Xenotech Labs on Indar, or Lithcor Fortress to North Grove Post on Amarish, you'll probably get a good idea of what I'm talking about. That concept is important to keep in mind because progress is what makes fights to bases fun. Having to shift from one piece of cover to the next, not being stuck ramming your head against the same thing over and over and over again. That's why bases like Subterranean Nanite Analysis are so frustrating, because there is no progress. It's literally the same chokes until one side breaks under the pressure of overpopulation, or their sunderers get destroyed on the surface. Anecdotally, I also feel like this is why the Battlefield games are fun. You start out having a lot of cover, and then the cover is slowly destroyed. It forces movement and progression of the map and objectives, And when the map does get flattened, depending on which Battlefield game we're talking about, it's more like Esamir when the experience starts to become less enjoyable until the match ends. Fortunately for Battlefield, matches reset, so you generate that curve again from scratch each and every time. Hossin is also a bit claustrophobic because of the tall trees, the plateaus, they're just all over the place. They obscure the sky, they don't leave sight lines over them, you can't have a sight line to the next base more often than not. You can make the argument that southeastern Indar is kind of like that, and it is, but the entire map is not like that, and the majority of your time is not spent fighting there. Indar's plateaus also have paths to get on top of them, which incorporates them directly into the strategy of the map and attacking or defending certain bases. One of the issues that I feel is overlooked when this topic comes up is the color scheme. When you look at Hossin, it's mostly shades of green. Trees are green, leaves are green, rocks are green, ground is green, swamp is green, the sky is orange, but creates a haze that blends everything else together, and the fog doesn't do anyone any favors either. All of that gets worse when you're playing with shadows off or lower settings in general. There are some darker greens, but most of it is sort of a pukey, hazy lime green. It's certainly not that there aren't other colors in the palette on Hossin, it's just that they aren't explored all that much. There are some flora that have a teal or a bioluminescent orange or a red, but it's more rare than it probably should be, which brings up another point in that the contrast on Hossin is limited. Most of the real color comes out at night, and players do not enjoy playing in the darkness as much as they do during the day cycle, so it's kind of a wash either way. If you look at Indar and Amarish, for example, they have blue skies, green grass, gray mountains, and in Indar's case you have the desert that contrasts the sky as well. Hossin's fog and lighting is actually better than it used to be because of some of the adjustments that the art team has made over time, so it's not as if this is a dead-end line of pursuit. There are still some adjustments that can be made. It's purely speculation, but I have a hunch that the players primarily enjoy their more temperate continents because it feels more familiar to them. The majority of players live in places where the seasons shift, where the sky is blue, go figure, and that the grass is green. In World of Warcraft's first expansion, the Burning Crusade, how many people thought that the starting zone was the best thing in the world? The red, barren, scarred mess? Probably nothing percent of people, but I bet your experience got a little bit better once you first hit Nagrand. That's kind of the point that I'm trying to drive home. On Hossin, there also seems to be performance concerns for a fair amount of players. I don't think that I've ever felt that personally, but it's certainly a common complaint specifically on Hossin. Fun fact about the plateaus that are everywhere though is that you need terrain to occlude bigger objects in the background. For example, if there's a biolab next to an amp station, you don't want them to be within line of sight of one another because it'll drop your performance a whole bunch, and Hossin is a slightly smaller, more dense continent, so the terrain occluders perhaps make more sense there than they do on other continents. Lastly, people talk about the benefits of Hossin being poor, the gameplay benefits that you get for capturing the continent. Quite frankly, I don't think this has much to do with why players don't play on Hossin at all, because back at release, Hossin actually provided you with an experience bonus for playing on the continent. Maybe this made sense for players since it was a personal benefit, but while you were fighting there, no one actually had that bonus because it required a lock of the continent, and locks didn't provide persistent benefits like they do now. Later, that benefit was changed to be 50% off max units. Max units, of course, have a substantial impact on the most common form of gameplay, being infantry combat. So you can argue that it would have made sense to take that benefit so that you can be more dominant on other continents. But I don't really think that's the case. The players who actually pursue a continental benefit as a game objective are so rare that it's almost not worth mentioning. Benefits that are actively pursued are usually done so via ghost cappers on whichever continent is the most dead and currently open. If players were seeking out these benefits to a substantial degree, we'd be seeing a lot more organized play from larger outfits, but that's not the case, as shown by all the zerging up and down the lattice lanes. Players aren't contesting one another for strategic control of territory, they're not focusing on stacking and destroying hives, or we'd see a lot less neutral cores and more intelligent placement of bases than we see nowadays. Until there is a reason to fight, benefits will continue to be happenstance and continent locking will continue to feel meaningless or detrimental. A different topic that's been covered a few times in the past, but I did want to bring it up because people often suggest changing Hossin's benefits so that players will fight there, but that's just not true. So what can be done about Hossin so that players will play there more often? To me, it comes down to three main things: aesthetics, spacing, and flow. For aesthetics, if we can get the skybox to a state where it contrasts the terrain more, that would be a good start. Esamir has the same problem, but Esamir is also white instead of a pukey green. I feel like Amarish has a good skybox to work with, but if you were to swap them both out, then Hossin is no longer really Hossin. So there's got to be a happy medium in there somewhere. Some of that comes from the fog as well. If it was a different color, maybe a bit darker or less, it could probably draw better contrast and help break up some of the green without actually having to touch the color of the terrain tiles. Spacing is a double whammy because I personally think that you could get away with clear cutting some of the trees and creating more open areas. You could probably also get away with lowering the plateaus while still keeping the occluders where they need to be just to maintain that performance. And if you cull enough of the right props, that performance potentially goes up as well. Some of this can also come with the outright removal of some bases from the lattice, possibly even keeping some of the capture points there to build around and even to be vehicle capturable. Hossin is the continent definitely in most need of more room, not only for vehicles but for the construction system as well. Flow, to me, comes down to removing some of the corridor feeling that the plateaus and tall trees create. And it also gives you the opportunity to vary the terrain more, creating more natural cover and reducing the reliance on rocks, trees, and vines that are currently in place now. If we allow players to get those better foot-zerg down the lattice moments that you see on Amarish and Indar, that would go a long way toward making the continent feel better. The last question to ask would be, is it actually worth revamping Hossin at all? Because that's essentially what this comes down to. The reason that continent changes come as bigger revamps instead of smaller chunks are a combination of factors, one of which is marketing. It's easier to promote a continental revamp than it is to promote incremental changes over time. That may sound silly on the outside, but players who leave the game may be interested in coming back to check out big changes. That's much harder to get across when things are being done incrementally. More importantly though is the download size. Whenever we modify terrain and not just add or remove objects from it, you can create a long download for the player. Long downloads means more time a player can't play, or it gives them a better reason to avoid playing altogether, say if they have a crappy connection or they were just looking for an excuse to quit in the first place. Less playtime means less revenue, and less players means a crappier experience for the rest of us who do continue to play. It's all the more reason why you'd want to market a revamp as something significant so that players look forward to the download instead of shy away from it. So there you go, nice history lesson, Hossin theory, and a market lesson all in one. But if this video has been interesting, helpful, or entertaining, please feel free to like, subscribe, tell your friends about the channel. And if you enjoy or do not enjoy Hossin, let me know the reason why you do or do not play there in the comment section down below. Like I said, a lot of this is just theory that comes from having played this game for so long, but my personal feelings and opinions may not necessarily reflect how the majority of players feel, so any insight that you can offer is helpful and appreciated. Thanks very much, folks. Wrel signing off.